Hello, I'm Jackie Miller, the host of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series, joining you today from the territory of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, where I'm grateful to be able to live, work, and study. Today's dialogue, Why Reconciling Ways of Knowing, is the first in a series of online dialogues we are planning until we can host our in-person forum. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Valérie Courtois, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. We recommend that you use the gallery view, which you can find at the top of your Zoom screen, where you can toggle back and forth between Valérie and speaker view, as some of our speakers will be using phone for audio and computer for video, and that can help you to see them when they're speaking as opposed to see their audio. We've turned off the chat feature and ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen for your questions. We will gather like questions together for the moderator and address all questions as time allows, so please submit your questions early. The session will run for about an hour and a half, but it may go longer depending on the number of questions received, up to 2 hours. Please note that our speakers are based in different locations and have different Wi-Fi connections and may have different volume levels, so please adjust your volume as necessary. And we're recording the dialogue so that anybody who is unable to participate in the entire session can view it online later. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Valérie Courtois. Valérie Courtois is the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, an organization dedicated to the strengthening of Indigenous nationhood, including supporting a national Indigenous Guardians Network, which brings together Indigenous knowledge and science across Turtle Island. She's a member of the Innu Nation and a registered professional forester specializing in Indigenous issues and ecosystem-based management and planning. Over to you, Val.
Thanks, Jackie. And I just want to take this moment to welcome everybody who's joined us online. It's really great to see such a crowd joining this forum. Now, before we get started, we want to really set things up in a good way. And our way of doing that is to start in ceremony. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Elder Dr. Dave Courchene, or Nigani Aki Inini, which also means leading Earthman. He's a respected elder and knowledge keeper of the Anishinaabe Nation. He's devoted his life to creating a healthy environment for current and future generations, carrying messages of hope and peace around the world. His leadership and stewardship have had global influence. His work and vision have been recognized through many prestigious honors, including Elder Courchene's work having been recognized with an honorary doctorate of law from the University of Winnipeg. He shares the ancient knowledge of the original peoples of Turtle Island, which he believes can act as the foundation in supporting the new life that Mother Earth is now entering, and that the elders have confirmed have arrived. Please, Elder Dr. Courchene, start us off in a good way.
Thank you very much, Val, for the kind introduction. In keeping with the spirit of our ancestors, we are asked never to overstep the gifts that we have received from our Great Spirit that connect us to the spiritual realm. And this morning I did a sunrise pipe ceremony, asking that we be guided today in the words we speak, that we're able to reach the most important part of our being, according to the knowledge keepers, is the spirit that is in each of us. Because it is understood that it is in spirit that the truth is reflected. And the gifts that we have been given as a people will become more acknowledged today. And the elders have said many times that we are in our homeland, the homeland of the pipe. Because it is the pipe that has been with our people for tens of thousands of years, ensuring that we always have a connection to the spiritual world. And we were given a language as part of our identity as a people that is embedded with the knowledge that we carry today as the knowledge keepers of our nations. So I want to share a prayer in my language, that we be given this time together, that we are able to unite in a common effort of taking better care of the earth, the one we refer to as Miteke, kind Mother Earth. We got me on now, got the building it models when me way Germany. We got me the name in the wall, we give me not an ishinabe, money giving chayat, minupimatism. We give me not gain an ishinabe, money giving chip was set them up. We give me not where, which is the back on again. Since Satan way any chip was set them up. We got gained and I know come, say, can me go and what you got to double. The other description in we meet young and in a went on in Chon Daddy's young. We meet a mini go on, we see when the Bemis Kikian, who scares a Knamoyan, one inch in his way is young Martin. Jabba ton my me way, Gijay artisan. Buxeni Mark gave in all Atso Khan and Sondan, Wabanong Shabanong, Migabianong Soget. Buxen down gave in and went away no one to Chicago on, when it's Chiganotamang. Me way Vijay artisan. Chiganotamang Minik. Major when Dagos again with the actor. Neither says the book send the man when on them. To get the Makta Wang man on them. The Chikskit to Wang again in which he Chigaway not the man Aningagi Shikanamago was there. Chigaway Kanamago again, me chip martes, who read the share up in the man Nina. You need to get the Nishinabe Jiminoya, Jonas, Scott, Minimal, Job and Dung. Niken and I go away, I Jimmy goes to Bucket now. You have modded you. Jimmy goes. Thank you, Valerie.
Jinish commit now, Dave, for that beautiful opening prayer. At this time, I'd like to start the dialogue by introducing both David Suzuki and Miles Richardson, who are at the origin of this idea of having a real dialogue around how we reconcile ways of knowing. And you know, before we do that, I'd just like to say how much of an honor it is for me to be moderating this session as someone who is trained in classic sciences through my forestry degree, as well as having been in a lifelong journey of learning my own Innu heritage and knowledge and ways of knowing. This is something that has been kind of internalized by many of us, this dialogue, and it's really great to have it out. And I really hope that by reconciling our worldviews, our understandings, and our values, that we'll find a way to create, you know, and achieve collective good for us all and for Mother Earth. Dr. David Suzuki is a father, a grandfather, a geneticist, an environmental activist, and a broadcaster known particularly for his role on the CBC series, The Nature of Things. David, please tell us a little bit more about how this idea came to be.
Thank you very much, Val. I'm still in complete lockdown on the traditional unceded territory of the Wiwaikai Nation on Quadra Island. And I acknowledge and thank the first people who cared for this land and water for thousands of years, a record that no government or corporation can claim. Thank you all for joining us for what I hope will be a continuing dialogue of a very important subject. I am a scientist by training and inclination. After graduating from high school in 1954, I spent 8 years getting my education in the United States. In 1957, my last year of undergraduate college, I was electrified to hear that the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, a satellite. And in the months and years that followed, the United States poured huge amounts of money into universities, into students, into new organizations like NASA to catch up to the Russians. And even though I was a foreign student in the United States, all I had to do was say, well, I like science, and they gave me money. It was a glorious time to be a science student. I had been accepted to medical school at the University of Western Ontario in London, but I got so excited about genetics that I finally turned it down and abandoned it to study as a full-time geneticist. Mind you, my mother cried for months after, thinking that her son had turned down a chance to be a doctor to become an expert in insects. I was interested in genes and chromosomes, and I studied them in fruit flies. Fruit flies were what we just called flying bags of chromosomes. We weren't interested in the animal. We're interested in focusing on genes and chromosomes. And that's really the essence of what we now know as reductionism. That is, we focus, in my case in genetics, on a gene or a chromosome, and we try to isolate it from everything else so that we can control whatever is impinging on that bit of nature and measure everything that comes out of it then, and that we then understand that little bit of nature. Of course, it simplifies the system when we do it that way, but it's all about controlling the input and output and measuring. And it was based really on Isaac Newton's notion that the universe was like a giant clockwork mechanism, a mechanical thing that if you studied the cogs and the wheels and the springs, eventually you'd be able to put it all back together and understand the whole thing. In 1962, I wanted to come home to Canada, and I came home to the University of Alberta for my first job, and I was a hotshot geneticist, man. I was going to make my mark, and I got completely derailed by a woman. Story of my life. But in this case, it was a woman named Rachel Carson who published a book called Silent Spring, all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. Now you have to remember, pesticides were considered one of the great scientific discoveries. When Paul Muller discovered that DDT kills insects, well, and it didn't seem to harm people or anything else, he won a Nobel Prize in 1948. And farmers then began to use pesticides in vast amounts. I remember we were, this is after the war, we lived on a farm, and my mother would come every night when dinner was set on the table. She'd take a can of DDT and spray it all over the food, and that DDT would settle down onto our
Dave, I think you may have accidentally muted yourself.
Sorry. And people began to notice fish were acting strange and birds were disappearing, and they tracked it down and discovered something that scientists didn't even know about called biomagnification. You increase the concentration of chemicals up the food chain. This is now a fundamental part of our understanding of biology, but until pesticides, we had no idea. In focusing and controlling, we fragment nature. We look at nature in bits and pieces, and we become blind to their interconnections. You know, we could study DDT in Florence flasks, in growth chambers, even in test plots on the land. But, you know, the wind blows, it rains, it snows, and that DDT doesn't stay confined to a farmer's field and ends up all over the place. Today, we have no idea of the long-term impact of what's going on in the tar sands of Alberta, or the proposal that the Chilcotin people fought for years to use a sacred lake as a dumping ground, a tailings pond for their mining operations. So, you know, what science does in focusing, we can't see the interconnectivity. Scientists are great at describing things. We look out and discover all kinds of things because we don't know anything about it. One of the great insect experts in the world, a man named Tom Eisner at Cornell, once told me that he could go into Central Park, this is in the middle of New York City, any day and discover a new species of insect. We know this is in the middle of a big city. We know very little, and scientists discover all kinds of things, but we don't know enough about how they are interconnected. And, you know, an example, there are probably 12 to 15 Nobel Prizes have been given to scientists studying fruit flies, believe it or not. But we still have no idea how fruit flies survive the winter in Edmonton. We have no idea how a simple egg of a fruit fly changes first into a larva and then into an adult. So the essence of science is observation. And we learn a great deal in our discoveries. But the way science operates is this. You look out in the world and you make a series of observations. And then you say, well, how does that all work? So you set up a hypothesis. And once you have a hypothesis of how it all works, you can do an experiment. You do the experiment, you gather data, and then you look at your hypothesis and say, what does that mean? And then usually you either say, oh, I've got to change that hypothesis, or you toss it out. And then you go on and do another test. So, you know, when you think about it, the essence of science is that we're proving most of our current ideas are wrong. That's the way science progresses. So then the question is, why are we so anxious to run and apply every little bit of knowledge that we acquire when chances are they're going to be effects we hadn't anticipated? Atomic bombs, great scientific innovation when they were dropped over Japan. Yeah, there were reasons to do that, end the war quickly and so on. We didn't know when atomic bombs were dropped on Japan that there was a thing called radioactive fallout. We didn't know there were electromagnetic pulses of gamma rays. We didn't know there was a phenomenon we think of as nuclear winter. When CFCs began to be used in huge quantities, we didn't know they would drift up into the atmosphere and ultraviolet light from the sun would break chlorine-free radicals off CFC and scavenge ozone. We didn't know any of that stuff. And so we're very anxious to apply our discoveries, but not humble enough to realize that this could have ramifications we can't expect. Now, too much of science in its applications is being driven by money, is being driven by the need for power or control, with little to guide us or constrain us or caution us in the way that we apply that knowledge. And there is a fundamental flaw in Isaac Newton's idea of a mechanical universe. The essence of reductionism assumes that by studying the parts, we can eventually put the parts together and understand the whole. In other words, the whole system is just the sum of all of the parts. But you can ask a physicist, define all of the physical properties of atomic hydrogen and all of the physical properties of atomic oxygen. And they can do that right down to the electrons and neutrons and protons. But then you say, Mr. Physicist, if I take 2 atoms of hydrogen and combine them with 1 atom of oxygen to make a molecule called H2O, what are the properties of H2O? You know what they say? I'll be damned if I know. Because when you put them together, they interact and new properties emerge that can't be predicted from the parts. And this is what Nobel Prize winner Roger Sperry calls emergent properties. These are properties that emerge out of the combination. And so our whole idea of studying parts with the idea we're going to understand the whole is completely illusory. It won't work that way. Now, Jane Goodall's classic work is a great illustration of the problem. Up until Jane Goodall started her work, zoologists assume that if you take chimpanzees and study them in a cage or study them in a zoo, that you'll be able to know everything there is to know about chimpanzees. And Jane did this outrageous thing. She said, I'm going to study chimpanzees in the wild where they live. And when she did that, guess what? She discovered all kinds of things that we didn't know about, that they are very communal animals, that families are very important, that females are the dominant creatures that hold the whole community together, that they play together, they work together, they go on hunting parties together, they make war, they create tools. All of that Jane discovered by looking at the animals in the wild. And until then, we thought we know everything there is to know about chimps by what we study in zoos. We established the David Suzuki Foundation in 1990. Miles was a fundamental part of our establishing the organization. And we wanted to work in partnership with all our projects with the Indigenous people, but our studies would be based on the best scientific information we had available to us. In the 1990s, NATO jet pilots were being trained to fly at very low levels over the big plains of Labrador. And the Innu people, who are caribou people, began to object because they said those low-level flights are affecting the health of our herds. And they began a campaign to stop the low-level flights. And I happened to be in Goose Bay when there was a hearing over this issue. And I was struck with the way that the Innu elders and the hunters first testified before a committee. And they talked about how when they shoot the first animal, they immediately cut it open. They examine the parts, the heart, the lungs. They're basically doing an autopsy. And they said, we know those animals are suffering. The females are miscarrying. They're suffering damage to the liver. We understand that these animals are being affected and we want the flights stopped. And the committee members went, thank you very much. And then the expert, a scientist from McGill, came on. And this expert has a PhD, and he comes out there to Labrador for 2 or 3 months a year with a couple of students. They try to radio collar a dozen animals. And this is a herd of over 100,000 animals. Half the time they can't find them. And he's the expert. And you could see that in the way he was treated. And that just didn't make any sense to me at the time. Now, on the BC coast, herring are a fish that are one of the key species in the whole food chain of marine animals, from seals and eagles to whales, but especially salmon. And for years, there had been a commercial harvest, which is an incredible operation where these huge seine nets are spread around and can take an entire population with just one set. You get tons and tons of herring. And the population of herring, it used to be that you could go out in a punt and rake herring and fill your punt with herring right off the kelp beds. Though that abundance disappeared. It used to be 50 years ago, any fishing area, fishing store would have a live tank of herring to go fishing. There aren't any anymore. The herring have simply disappeared. And a commercial fleet has been very effective. A few years ago, DFO said, we're going to open a limited herring fishery. And the New Channels, the Hiltzik and the Haida said, absolutely not. This doesn't make any sense. The populations are simply too depleted to allow a commercial set. Within the David Suzuki Foundation, I was shocked to see that our staff were saying, well, DFO studies the DNA of the herring. And they say that the herring, in fact, from DNA studies, are a single breeding population. So you can take out the population over here, but they will ultimately be replaced because they're a single breeding population. Meanwhile, the Indigenous people were saying absolutely not. And this is when I said there is something fundamentally wrong, that even in the foundation, we have elevated science to where it becomes, in fact, superior to the Indigenous people who've lived with herring and salmon for thousands of years. It just didn't make sense to me. And this is when I tried to persuade Miles that we've got to do something about this, because right now it's DFO and government scientists who seem to be dictating the whole thing. And Miles, especially from the Haida, has experience with how that can turn out. So with that, over to you, Miles.
Thank you so much, David, for that great introduction. I learn something every time you have something to say, and that's part of why you're such a treasure. I'd like to introduce Miles. Miles is a good friend. He's also known as Kilsley Gajik Singh, a citizen of Haida Nation and an officer of the Order of Canada. Miles, you can correct my pronunciation when you start. I saw you smile. He served as the president of the Council of the Haida Nation and chief commissioner of the BC Treaty Commission. He also serves on board of directors or advisory boards of several influential Indigenous organizations and non-governmental organizations, including the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the David Suzuki Foundation, as David presented earlier. He currently serves as director of the National Consortium on Indigenous Economic Development at the University of Victoria. Miles.
Thank you, Val. Hello, and good morning, good afternoon to all the panelists and all the participants. It's great to have everyone together talking about this important issue. I want to thank Dave Courchene for starting us off properly and with prayer and proper ceremony. One of the good things about this pandemic we're facing is that I get to talk to you from home, from Skidegate in Haida Gwaii, and been hunkered down here for a couple of months now, and it's been just a good opportunity to be home amongst family and my own people, and it's been a good time. If any of you leave this dialogue today and the subsequent dialogues with one thing, I'd like it to be this: that to do things properly, to do things in a good way, we begin with ceremony. I know that Dave Courchene has reminded us of that, and at our prep gathering for this dialogue in 2017 at his Turtle Lodge, the results of that meeting were to all of our organizers that everything we do with reconciling ways of knowing, we must begin with proper ceremony. And as Dave would remind us, that's very simple. It's about gratitude. Beginning with proper ceremony is saying thank you for all the blessings we enjoy. And that opens responsibility, opens the door to accepting responsibility for who we are as humans. And also it's a reminder that we're all in this together, that we're all one with the rest of creation, amongst ourselves as human beings. We're all one, we're interdependent. What befalls one of us befalls all of us. And if we're going to live in a good way, in a sustainable way, we best always act with the knowledge of that truth. And if this pandemic has brought about any good, there's one thing that I've noticed has been, I would term it a global consensus. As much as you can have a global consensus in this crazy world, but that consensus has been, we're all in this together. I've heard that from left-wing politicians, right-wing politicians, men, women, Indigenous people, others. And we're on a strong path here, I believe. And in my life, I've come to trust ceremony as a necessary precondition to making transformative change, to making good change in society. I know as a young leader of the Haida Nation in the mid-'80s, when we were standing up in the face of the destruction of our homelands, the logging industry. We came to a really pivotal moment when the pressure was on our nation. And as a young leader, I felt that pressure enormously. Our people had stood on the line, had initially stopped the logging. We were dragged through court, and the logging was about to start up again. So we moved ahead of the logging and put up a traditional house in what on the map is called Windy Bay. And it was unclear what was going to happen next, whether the industry and governments had enough and they were going to steamroll us. A lot of people had come to our aid, stood beside us when a wonderful thing happened. 2 Cree medicine men arrived, and they were emissaries from the Hopi Nation who'd been observing our battle. And these emissaries brought crystals from the Hopi knowledge keepers with instructions, directional instructions on how to bury them in the watershed we're fighting to protect. So our elders received the emissaries, received the crystals, went out into the watershed and did these instructions and really dug deep to remember our ceremonies. A big part of what we're doing was remembering who we are as Haida people and invoking our culture. If there's any reason that we're here after what scientists have aged at 15,000 plus years, it's because of our culture. And I'll tell you, when those crystals were buried and our ceremonies became aligned, everything changed. Everything became easy. Governments started coming on board. Powerful groups stepped forward to our support, and soon it became inevitable that the destruction of our homelands, of the forest and that part of Haida Gwaii, was inevitable. Today, the Haida Nation has to agree on any land use decisions over all of our islands. In no small way, that was due to invoking our culture and the power of ceremony. Any of you look at a living Haida today, or any nation in this country, or any Indigenous person on Turtle Island, we're the living generation of ancient cultures. Our people have been 15,000 years at least. Suffice it to know we've been here since our creation. Do you think that the fact that we're still here is a coincidence? I want each of you to ask yourself that question. Do you think that's a coincidence? And if it's not, why is that? I say to you that that's because of ceremony, invoking ceremony and using our observations and lessons, hard-won lessons from living and experiencing the same place, our homeland, on this earth over great expanses of time, and distilling that knowledge, that accumulated experience, into ceremony, into rituals, into our cultures that are available to us today. There's hope. We can get beyond this challenges that we're facing as human species. The Haida Nation and every Indigenous people on this earth are testament to that. And remember, every person on this earth is Indigenous to somewhere. So in coming forward to this conversation today, David had approached me as director of the National Consortium for Indigenous Economic Development, and of course I'm a board member on the David Suzuki Foundation. And David said, if you're going to be supporting Indigenous economies, we'd better figure out how Indigenous traditional knowledge and science can get along. You know, we look out at all the challenges facing us as humankind: reconciliation between Indigenous people and nation states, the climate crisis affecting the survival of humans, the loss of biodiversity affecting the well-being and survival of humans. And we're seeing those issues play out in battles that have defined our lives, he said. The battle over Guayhanas in the Stein Valley to protect the forests, the battle over our relationship with fish, the herring that David just talked about, in a situation here in our community, Copper Bay, where our people have lived off this one little creek that's provided blueback to our community forever. Their preferred food for our people. CFO came in 30, 40 years ago and decided they were going to manage it their way. Almost brought the run to extinction before our people decided that we got to take it back and control it our own way according to our own traditions. And that run is getting back, almost back up to historical numbers. We heard the example of the boreal forest and the home of the caribou and the caribou people and the challenges there. We've seen recently the efforts to protect our rivers and coasts in the face of pipelines. Big issues that are in our face every day, and if we're going to resolve them, the fundamental clash here, David said, and I agreed, was the battle between Indigenous traditional knowledge and science. The whole Western paradigm is guided by science. So we need to set up a dialogue, he said. We need to have Canadians address these challenges and opportunities and explore the opportunities of each of those ways of knowing and the synergies, the transformative synergies that are possible by finding a way for them to work together. So the purpose of this dialogue is to find our way forward together by respecting both ways of knowing. We went out and looked if there was interest, and here you are, over 500 of you today listening and participating in this dialogue, a dialogue that we intend to continue with streams, hopefully monthly discussions on topics within this dialogue, and hopefully sometime soon we'll have an opportunity to get together. But when we look at Indigenous traditional knowledge and science, they're embedded in something that when I look at the world, when I look out across Canada, I see a mighty struggle going on also between two paradigms. That's two world views or stories of people. One is the ancient truth, the ancient fact of the continuing existence of nations, Indigenous peoples, struggling against what I'd call this colonial paradigm, Western society that's come in the form of the nation state of Canada that bases its knowledge and its application of that on science. And it's not been a positive picture for Indigenous people as the last 300 years have unfolded in this country. And I believe, and one thing I want to bring to this dialogue, and I know many of you do, is that if we're going to solve these issues between ourselves as humans and work out our relationships as humans, we need to establish between Indigenous people and nations, nation states, this nation-to-nation relationship. That in our homeland, Indigenous people must be respected as who we are. And our Indigenous people need to step forward and be who we are and invoke our understandings, invoke our cultures, and work with our neighbors who we've welcomed into our territories to hear the truth, to understand the truth, and our cultures help us do that, and to live in a sustainable way. Ceremony will help us and guide us in doing that. Being who we know we are, understanding our cultures through our elders, and invoking those cultures, having the fortitude, the integrity to live those cultures. It's all there. I know after all the times that we've been involved in political action, building relations with other nations around this country, around this Turtle Island, we got into a dialogue with other spiritual leaders. And I remember being at the Fourth World Wilderness Congress with about 20 spiritual leaders from around North America. They wanted to hear the Haida Nation story. So Guaganut, Diane Brown, and I traveled to meet them in Denver, Colorado. And we're sitting around a big table in the morning at this conference, 55 nations talking about the future of the world and the economy and environment. They wanted to hear my story. They're hearing our story, the Haida story. And I love talking, going on and on about all the woes that had befallen us, how we're losing our forests, how we're losing our language, how we're losing our governance, how we're losing our ceremonies. Anyway, one of the elders finally, I think, got tired of hearing me, and I thought he was sleeping, but he looks up at me and says, I don't know if this is his words, but this is how it sounded to me. Hey, young fella, you know all those things you're talking about losing? Your language, your ceremonies, your forests, your oceans. He said, they haven't gone anywhere. He said, they're in exactly the same place your forefathers found them. You've just forgotten how to listen. And I'll tell you, he said, I give you one piece of advice. Before you take another step forward, take a step back and remember how to listen. I don't think I talked again that week. And we'd all be well to hear that story. And in each of our territories, in each of the relationships we build amongst each other as humans and the rest of creation, we remember how to listen. The road ahead will become clear. Over the rest of this gathering, the rest of this morning, I hope to talk about outcomes that we want to see out of this dialogue. As I said, we're going to continue and perhaps have monthly topics around this dialogue, and we got to figure out a way to reconcile with Mother Earth. I know even my friend Jim Prentice, who was Premier of Alberta, who passed on a few years ago, we'd have battles over pipelines and Alberta's energy policy and all those things. But one thing we agreed on is we're not going to reconcile between Canadians and First Nations and Indigenous people until we collectively reconcile with this place we call home, with Mother Earth. They go hand in hand. And we've got to figure out that. We've got to look at that as we make strategies going forward. Reconciling with each other here in Canada is going to require breathing life into this nation-to-nation relationship. First Nations have been calling for it since the first explorers and colonizers came to these lands. And now the federal government has made it a national policy. We just need to make it real and do it in a proper way. We need to figure out ways of reimagining our economy. A year ago, it was still a pressing priority. With this pandemic, it's an urgent imperative. And in many ways, this pandemic has given us an opportunity to do things we might not have had the courage to before. Because if one thing's clear, we must bring change. So thank you all for participating in this dialogue. I hope we can address any questions going forward. Hawa, thank you.
Now, Miles, thank you very much. I just want to note, Miles, that we've lost your video feed. So the Reconciling Ways of Knowing staff has suggested that you may try logging off the video feed and logging back on so that we can see you. But of course, everybody was very enthralled by your voice and your words. In fact, there have been many comments to that effect while you were speaking. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy Turner. It's a real honor, Nancy, to have you join us here. She is an emeritus professor of environmental studies at the University of Victoria and a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of British Columbia. She's an ethnobotanist who has worked with Indigenous elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern North America for over 50 years, helping document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and habitats, including Indigenous foods, materials, and medicines, as well as language and vocabulary relating to plants and environment. Dr. Nancy, can you tell us a little bit more that how you as a Western trained ethnobotanist really came to appreciate Indigenous knowledge and science and how they can come together?
Thanks so much, Val. It's a real honor for me to be here with all of you. And I've just been fascinated to hear from my friends and colleagues so far. It's really nice to participate in this. I want to thank Dave Courchene for making our opening so valuable and clearing the way for this discussion to continue. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm here in the territory of the Snuneymuxw Nation, Coast Salish peoples, on just off Vancouver Island here on Protection Island. And I really enjoyed listening to David's history of his own history because mine somewhat paralleled it. My mother wanted me to be a medical doctor too, but I was fascinated with plants from the time I was just a little kid. And by the time I got into university, I was already well on the way to joining this fascinating field that has been called ethnobotany, because I was interested not just in the plants themselves, but in the ways that we have used them for food, materials, medicine. I was always trying edible plants when I was growing up. My dad and my granddad were both entomologists, so I had a good, strong science background. When I got to university, I started doing a project on ethnobotany, working with local Coast Salish peoples here on southern Vancouver Island. My first teacher, Christopher Paul from Sartlip, was an amazing man who was very kind and guided me in the ways that Miles is describing about, you know, encouraging you to listen and encouraging you to participate and to practice. And those are lessons that I started out learning and have become stronger as I've gone along. At first, I was interested in just the basic names for the plants and how they were used. The kind of knowledge that really blends very well with Western scientific knowledge, practical knowledge about what is good to eat, what isn't good to eat, how you can use the fibers in plants and how you can use them and that kind of thing. As I went along, I started learning a little bit more from many, many wonderful elders and knowledge holders from many different nations. Not that there was so much more depth to people's relationships with plants and with their environments than I ever started out understanding. And it's been a continuous learning for me. I've never stopped being a student. And one of the things that I've learned is that the scientific knowledge that I grew up with and I was trained with really represents only a part of Indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems, say around the knowledge of plants or environments, are so much broader. They actually extend across all of the different fields that you might encounter in a university, from linguistics, philosophy, political science, governance, education, as well as the sciences. And so we have, as well as that practical knowledge of how plants are used and the way that plants are named, we have the values, the worldview, the respect that has been talked about, the reciprocity, the understanding that we have an obligation to all of the other living things that we share the planet with. And we have to respect them, we have to use them wisely, and we have an obligation to them. So this underlying worldview has been called kincentricity by some of my Indigenous colleagues, Dennis Martinez and Enrique Salmon. And what it means is that we as humans are actually related. We have, the other species are our relatives. And indeed, David, as a geneticist, can tell us that we are related to all the other living things on the earth. We all have the same original makeup. And so if we think of the trees, the animals, the fish as our generous relatives who provide us with what we need, we see that we have an obligation to them. You wouldn't just go in and to your grandmother's living room and trash it and throw it around and break things. And yet that's what we have done to our forests. That's what we've done to our trees. As well as the worldview and the values that are embodied within this knowledge system are the ways of communicating that knowledge, the stories, the ways to teach children. And often these are experiential learning and learning from stories. Stories make a wonderful way of teaching and embodying knowledge to pass on to the future. Language is so important in that way. The words that people use are really important, and that's why it's really good to learn words of gratitude, for example, hawa, or kukschamch, or haichka, in any number of languages. Those are really important words to learn. And as well as the education and the value system or the worldview and the practical knowledge are the ways of making decisions, the ways of planning. And there again, Indigenous knowledge holders look back through many generations. They build their knowledge on many generations, and they project their decisions forward, and they think about the generations to come. And I think in Western society, we're so focused on short-term, everything is short-term economic gain, that we sometimes forget that we should be making decisions based on the well-being of our children's children's children into the future. So I think I will stop there because we want to make sure that there's time for Dr. Courchene to finish and also for questions. And I really want to express appreciation for all of you out there who have joined us for this session today, and really glad that you could be here with us, and look forward to hearing questions from you. Thank you very much.
Nancy, thank you. By the way, when I say now, it means I thank you on behalf of all of the group. And so that's just so we folks on the line understand what that word means. So thank you very much, Nancy. At this time, I'd like to ask Dave to come back and tell us a little bit more about his perspective on the importance of ceremony, and also a little bit about the 2017 gathering that he held at the Turtle Lodge. And I don't know if folks have noticed, but in his background there, you can see a lovely picture, aerial picture of the Turtle Lodge. And so Dave, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Turtle Lodge as well.
Valerie, Mabu Joanin, the name Agnetuk, Nigani Akin, Dishnikas, Kinu do them, Saging Donji, Nishnaben thou. Chiboy Abajituan in Ezigi, that Wemstigo. No de Abajiton, Dashkani Naning, Gagijimini goes it gain and Shinabe, Chinon Dagos, Chabajituan gaining Minik, Gagijimini goes it gain and Shinabe. Buxeni Mark. Nimishom se took and son Danimark to be Jich Kauguan Manong. Chikskituan Wene, Chigaway Winter Mage, and Aningagi, Kanamago Zian, Kchanishnabe. You got Stashlinek. My dear relatives, let me first of all offer my appreciation to my colleagues who have stepped forward and to act in this capacity of being leaders to the concern that we have regarding our relationship to the land. Changing human behavior is the challenge of today. We have no choice but to change if we are going to survive. We have to reach a level of understanding. Nature has always rolled, governed by her laws that are self-enforcing. Breaking her laws brings a consequence, such as what we are witnessing today in climate change, the pandemic, and the upswing of racial intolerance. We have to begin by recognizing that Mother Earth is a living entity, and she has an intelligence we can all learn from. In prophecy, it was foretold the indigenous knowledge keepers would find themselves in a position of leadership. Knowledge keepers are those that have been identified by the people, raised in ceremony, speak their languages, and have a natural gift of leadership. Indigenous knowledge is based on a knowledge and understanding of sacred relationships. Sacred refers to values that respect all life. Indigenous knowledge is accessed from the teachings given by nature. We speak to our brothers, the trees, and to our friends in the animal world. This is where indigenous knowledge comes from. It is embedded in the earth itself. It is understood as a knowledge that gives understanding of the proper way of living. Our knowledge keepers can lead us in this process of returning to the earth. The knowledge keepers do not have a curriculum. Nature is the one who decides what each of us can learn when we follow basic principles and protocols of relationship with her. If you are searching for a knowledge keeper, a mentor, that is your responsibility to seek one out. In your efforts to find one, when you are sincere, you will find that support. Your own spirit will guide you to the right teachers. The big question we have is, where do we begin to transform ourselves into living our true purpose as human beings? It always begins with spirit. The old ones have said, the most important element of our being is spirit. In spirit, we were lowered from the spiritual realm and transformed into human form through the life givers, our mothers. Today, we suffer from a spiritual identity crisis. We have let our minds create a world that lacks moral and ethical integrity. Racial intolerance continues to tear us apart, when in truth, we are all brothers and sisters in the circle of life. Technology has done us well in many ways, but we have fallen short in expressing acts of kindness, compassion, and respect for the earth. Indigenous understanding begins with this understanding: to know, to feel the love from the land one needs to be connected to her. Nature must be respected as the original, true teacher to teach us about life and our place in this physical world. Through her, we can learn about unconditional love. That is the essence of her spiritual being. The great love of the Great Spirit has been manifested into nature herself. If you want to hug the Great Spirit, hug a tree. The essence of the Great Spirit is in everything that is alive. There is a law we follow, teachings that are given to a child that last forever, that can only be given by a woman or mother. It is in this understanding that Mother Earth is the universal teacher for all of humankind. We have neglected, overstepped in so many ways. Now is the time to return to her. As men, we have failed the mother. We have not honored and respected her. We have lived with an arrogant attitude for far too long, believing that we can own the land, when in fact we owe our existence to Mother Earth. We are all children of the earth, no matter how old that we may be. As humanity, we have failed in living out our true purpose. We have created a world that nature will not allow to continue. This destruction of the environment. Nature holds the final card for us to change. We must return to the beginning. Our lives began from the spirit and the land. We were born from the earth, the universal mother. And this is how we will be transformed. Mother Earth will mold us into our true humanity. We have to develop a new relationships in order for deep-rooted change to occur. An example of this is the rite of passage for a young boy. Preferably when he reaches puberty, he is put on a vision quest to seek a dream that will give him his purpose in life. For the young girls, it is Makoske, the way of the bear, learning the teachings of the life givers from the mothers and the grandmothers, and of course, being in ceremony on the land. The best advice I could ever give is for each of you to take the time to go to the land and hug a tree, one of the many relatives on the land, and listen to what she wants to teach you. Start there. All else will follow you to guide you to your greater purpose, and that is to serve life with love and kindness. Allow the knowledge keepers to help prepare you in ceremony before you go to the land. One final thought I would like to leave with all of you is that Mother Earth will help you to escape from the clutches of your misguided mind. Thank you. Miigwech for listening.
Now, Dave, thank you very much for that. I'd like to now suggest that we move to the questions, and we've been getting a lot of questions coming in as you've all been sharing, and they're all great questions. I hope that we can get to a lot of them. But of course, if we can't get to your question specifically, don't feel bad about that. There's going to be lots of opportunity for dialogues in future sessions, and I will, over time, be reminding folks, if I know, that there are specific sessions or specific topics that will be explored by these questions. So let's jump in right now. First question, and I think this would be well directed towards Miles, who has quite a bit of experience here. What do you feel is a step towards reconciliation in an environmental action? Do you think that there is a need and support to have committees within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in each Indigenous territories that requires a system of approval before decisions are made?
I will answer that question absolutely unequivocally. Establish a nation-to-nation relationship between the Crown and Right of Canada and the provinces and each nation in their territory, and go forward together, making decisions together around fish and everything else in that territory. First Nations have stated that's our objective. The federal Crown and most of the provinces have adopted that as the policy they're pursuing. It's eluded us. We need to get serious and listen to Dave Courchene, all the steps that we need to take to get there. We're all in this together. You know, it's about figuring our way forward together. And once we get over that, we're gonna, the solutions are gonna come. It's gonna take a big change in our attitude. You know, right now, setting up committees in terms of the status quo, the colonial paradigm, it's not gonna change a thing. You know, the policies and actions of the Crown are still about snuffing us out as people. That's not going to happen. We should take this moment. We have an opportunity to take this moment and get things back on the right path. But the step one there is establish that nation-to-nation relationship. Go forward making decisions together in each territory. Thanks, Val, and thanks for the question.
Thanks, Miles. We have got a couple questions about the younger generation and how do we, you know, how do we really bring in these cultures, rituals, traditions, understandings of climate and connectivity into non-Indigenous societies at a young age? And also, how do we teach our younger generation as Indigenous peoples to walk in both worlds? This is for any of you.
Let me respond to that as quickly as I can. I think, first of all, it must be said that our best hope for change will be in the hands of the youth, you know, of today. And they have to be represented in their voice. And we've heard many of them share this very deep concern of what is happening to the environment. But what I've always tried to inspire young people is to, you know, to allow themselves to be open to having mentorship, to help them, guide them, you know, through the knowledge that Indigenous people have in terms of having relationship with the land. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that we have to revolutionize the whole education system in this country. We can't continue to limit it only to the mind and, you know, with all that is taught in these schools. What we have done is we've locked them into these boxes and restricted our own children from experiencing the land. And the teachings that the elders share are universal to, you know, to all people, to all children. The children need to learn the values. And in our way here as Anishinaabe people, you know, we have the 7 laws that act as the foundation of how we should live and behave as human beings. And it is the animal world that carry and represent those teachings to ensure that we have a relationship with the land. To me, it's not a question of what race that you come from. The question is that we are all of the same source that we have come from, that we are all brothers and sisters, but we have a duty and a responsibility today as the teachers, you know, to be available for those young people and to create those environments for them to come and learn from Indigenous people. There's not very many places in this country that people could go and share and learn from the Indigenous people. And I think that's the first thing that we need to do as it was proposed in the first gathering in 2017, that there be these environments where knowledge is shared by the knowledge keepers. So it's going to take a collective effort on all of us, you know, to support the young people, to be able to hear the knowledge, you know, that the knowledge keepers carry. You go ahead.
Nancy, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thanks. Val, I'd like to add to that, and thank you for the response there, Dave, and Miles too. There's some really good models already existing that have been developed by people who are worried about this very thing. In terms of language, I think that, as I mentioned before, I see language as critically important to knowledge and learning. There's so many things that cannot be expressed well in English and need to be learned in an Indigenous language where they originate. And there are many people working on language revitalization, and Skidegate Haida is one of the really exciting examples of how young people are learning to speak their Haida language. And there are other ones too. There are language nests where children and young people go and actually live together with a speaker, an elder speaker of the language, in order to be able to be immersed in that language. And so I feel a lot more optimistic about this, about children learning than, say, a generation ago. And it's not just Indigenous children who need to learn about culture. All children, I think, around the world, there's so much urbanization that many children are not exposed to nature at all. As Dave was saying, that's so important to be out there, to be able to get out. There's been some books written like Last Child in the Woods and Nature Deficit Disorder that point out this problem. And I think it's a really important one for all of us to embrace, to find ways to get our children back out, to hug a tree and just to sit and be there in nature and get to know your relatives out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dave and Nancy for those answers. The questions keep on coming. Let's move to one from a colleague in the South. So she says she's a global South researcher who's not so familiar with the details of policy and development and implementation in Canada. What is the political will for collaborative and inclusive decision-making and democratization, that's a hard word for a French speaker to say, of governance to include Indigenous knowledge and systems and values? So Miles, you know, in Haida, you've worked on this kind of idea of bringing these world views together through your land use planning and marine use planning and through the Watchman program. How does that work, and do you see that improving over time?
Well, it's improved over time, but it's been a difficult one-way struggle. But these days, with talk of doing reconciliation properly, doing reconciliation at an equal level, on a nation-to-nation level, moving forward by agreement amongst the Crown and each nation in its territory, there's an opportunity to move this forward. And, you know, in the early days, I mean, to me, the early days are in the 80s, like early 80s, when our elders told the Haida Nation that we're not going to survive if they drill for oil and gas off our waters. We can't wait for the Ottawa and Victoria to look after our needs. If we're going to survive, we need to protect our life source. That's what every generation before us has done. They lived off Haida Gwaii, that's all we ever needed, and we need to protect it. Nobody listened to us. We had to stand up and armed only with our knowledge of the truth through our culture, and that we were right, and that we had an obligation to protect Haida Gwaii. We didn't negotiate, we stood up and we protected it. Soon, the Crown, you know, and the industries knew they had to deal with us. They came to the table, and it's evolved. But you know, when you talk about successes, in the mid-90s, the David Suzuki Foundation supported First Nations on the north coast of BC on an initiative called Turning Point, where they would sit down government to government with the province and make decisions about forests to end the battle in the woods. Oh my, you know, when the idea came forward, people would thought the sky was falling. How the heck can you give these Indians that kind of recognition and control? But very soon, when the final decisions were made at a government-to-government table with the First Nation in their territory in the province of British Columbia, you know, industry started getting what they wanted. The rate of cut came down, respect for other values started, and we made progress. There needs to be a lot more progress, but through that approach, the nation-to-nation approach, making decisions to get together on a nation-to-nation basis, it can be done. And forests are one thing, fish are another, language and culture. In every area, we need to do that. That's what building a new relationship is about. But it takes a commitment on both sides of that nation-to-nation equation. We're all here to stay. Let's just face it and get on with it.
Our next question is about ceremony, and really, you know, we're here on a Zoom format. We've got a Facebook Live going, and ceremony is something that's very personal and something that, you know, is seemingly done, you know, in an in-person thing. So how do we incorporate ceremony in this time of social distancing and in times of Zoom? You know, certainly there's an opening prayer or an opening statement, but are there other ways that we can incorporate ceremony?
I think to answer that question quickly is that you cannot incorporate or take, you know, the ceremony and indigenize an institution or even a gathering. There's certain things that are not allowed. I think what I did this morning with the pipe ceremony was following the ancestral ways of our people, that we invoke that spirit to come within the presence of whatever we're hoping to do during the day. And prayer is universal. I tried to capture that this morning by sharing, you know, the spiritual intent of, you know, using the gift of the sacred pipe. And I think that through the prayer, of course, we hope that people will give the time, you know, to be within that environment of ceremony. And that means going to where the people are performing those ceremonies, if they allow you. You know, we cannot force our way of life or impose it on anyone. You know, we can invite people, and it's up to people at that point, you know, to accept that invitation, because that is the way of Indigenous people, is we're always open to, you know, to sharing what we have, but we cannot see, you know, ceremony happening in this virtual reality.
Thank you very much, Dave. Next question, we've got a question that says that, you know, she's happy to be to have the Mother Earth described as the mother and acknowledging the feminine power of the earth. But she's wondering about the role of female leadership in reconciling our relationship with the earth, and how are female leaders being promoted within the environmental movement? And I think, you know, David and Miles, in your role, you may want to answer, and I'd be happy to speak to that question as well.
Go ahead, Miles.
Oh, I was waiting for you. Well, I'd say I wouldn't speak for the environmental movement, and I think in the environmental movement, my experience, you know, I've been on the board of the David Suzuki Foundation, which is a leader in the environmental movement. I mean, we've encouraged and we need more female involvement, I'd say. definitely we need that, and it's going to make things a lot better. In the Haida world, women have always been in charge, and I'm not saying that facetiously. We're a matrilineal society. Our identity, our names, our prerogatives, our responsibilities come through our mother's line, and at the head of each lineage or extended family is an Ulja that is in English referred to the matriarch. They appoint chiefs, they remove chiefs, they keep our society going in the right ways. And as we strengthen as a nation, that is strengthening within us. And they're related. You know, as they gain strength, our nation gains strength and stays on the good, right path. And that's a governance challenge today. We're very aware of it, and I think every nation is aware of it. Those who are committed to their values and believe in their values and are committing to living the right way. But there's a lot of potential there with empowering women more. I don't have the answers, but I agree with that.
I want to just take it a different way, and that is, I've been saying now for a number of years that the environmental movement has fundamentally failed. And, you know, this despite the fact that we've celebrated victories and battles. I remember when we hurried to Nature of Things to do films on the porcupine caribou herd and stopped the proposals to drill for oil near the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we stopped it. And so we said, oh, great, we've had a great victory. It wasn't a victory at all. There's still a proposal, and with Trump in now, it looks like they're going to go ahead and drill. We stopped back in the 70s and 80s, we stopped the proposal to build a dam at Site C on the Peace River. Well, guess what? It's already in the works now. We stopped the dam in the 1980s, late 1980s. We stopped a proposal to build a dam at Altamira in Brazil, and now that dam is near completion. And we fundamentally failed to change the way that we see the world. And of course, that transition, women who've been denied so much of the power and authority all these years have a fundamentally different perspective that is, I think, hugely important in the environmental movement. I think what we need, though, is for the environmental community to recognize that we've been focused on these battles that have been symptoms of deep underlying expressions of cultural values. And right now we're being driven heavily by the notion that the economy is the source of everything that matters. And when we come to grips with the fact that we can't go on that way, this Western system, after 500 years, it's run out of steam. It's destroying the very things that keep us alive and healthy. And we need now an alternate, and the alternate is the Indigenous people who've lived continuously in their lands for thousands and thousands of years. Not that they know, you know, in a world that has changed enormously with our technology has improved a tremendous amount, not that they know enough to apply these technologies in a different way, but it's the value system that determines what the consequences of our actions should be. And as Dave is constantly emphasizing, it's about the way that we treat our mother, and the mother that is the source of our life and so generous all these years. So I think that the environmental community now has got to start saying we haven't hit the reality that we cannot go on with the same paradigm that has been driving us for the last few centuries. And the recognition then is we need the leadership and the guidance of Indigenous perspectives. I believe the challenge now is, after hundreds of years of occupation by forces that say, you're worthless, your culture is not worth anything, you're worthless as a human being. That's had an impact, no question. It's amazing to me that the Indigenous perspective still survives, but we need that to be strong in order to provide that leadership in the nation-to-nation discussions that Miles talks about. So I think, to keep a culture alive, you need that to be imbued by the power of the land. We have all across Canada land that is called Crown land. That's not Crown land. That's land that has been occupied by Indigenous people. Then for God's sakes, give it back and provide a basis on which the young people coming up can renew and empower the lessons that they're gaining from their ancestors. And for the land that has not been returned, then for heaven's sakes, we all acknowledge the traditional territory, as I did when I opened that this is a traditional unceded territory of the Weewikai Nation, then for heaven's sakes, if it's their land, we've got to pay for being on it. We've got to pay a rental fee for being here. And it seems to me that every dollar that is raised or spent on these lands should go to the, out of every dollar, at least, I think 50 cents, but maybe 5 cents should go to the Indigenous people. So give back the land on which that culture can flourish, and give back the financial support that allows them to exist in our society today. I think those are the really critical issues that we have to face now.
The only thing that I would add, as a young woman leader of a Indigenous-led environmental organization, is that, in our own communities, we are living with the colonial legacy, and unfortunately, part of the colonial legacy has been to stifle women and to reduce the role of women in traditional governance. So there's exceptions to the rule, of course, places like the Haida Nation and other places that still have strong matriarchal recognition. But in my experience, we sometimes, we have a role to, and a bit of a ways to go in many cases to really recognize the role of women in thinking about the environment, and in deciding and being balanced in our approach to how we treat Mother Earth. And so that I think there's still a road to play, but we're on that path. And the more that we can create the space for dialogues like this, then the easier it'll be for women to really find their place in the movement. Our next question is about allyship, and how do people who are, in the traditional, really kind of environmental movement, the classic kind of model, how do they become good allies to the Indigenous movement? What does that look like? And are there, 2 or 3 important aspects or thoughts that you have to offer to people in the movement?
Val, I think that the first thing that we would hope for is that, our brothers and sisters that have arrived on our homeland would come to acknowledge, the true leadership in our homeland, which is really held by the original people, here in our homeland, and allow us to lead in terms of those discussions that are needed more than ever today, and allow us to also to be a part of the decision-making process, that we have an equal part in terms of changing the narrative in this country. We can't continue to leave Indigenous people, the original people, marginalized and not having a voice. And the best voice for Indigenous thought, Indigenous knowledge, and identity is really held by the knowledge keepers of our nations. And we have to create opportunities of support for them to be able to share that knowledge, and to be able to invite people to come within that environment that we have experienced in our life, that has brought us understanding of the sacredness of life itself. And I think the most challenging issue that we have today is to recognize the power of woman, which is the power of our biological mother, the power of Mother Earth herself. And we have to connect with that power. If we don't connect with the mother, we will destroy ourselves, because the sacredness really flows from the womb of where we were born with our own mothers. And the women have been displaced, you know, since history that I've been able to read. You know, they've been displaced, not allowed to live the fullness of their identity as the life givers of all nations. And it is the women today that should be supported in terms of creating those environments for all young girls to come and learn, you know, and appreciate the power and the sacredness that girls have is equal to the gifts that Mother Earth, you know, has for all of us. So I encourage people, you know, to, again, you know, to take the time, make the effort to come within our environment, you know, where we share those teachings. And it will just, you know, acquire some commitment, some time and some effort. So I hope that there will be people out there that will show an interest, and together we can change the narrative in this country, because it has to be done together. It can't be done by one part of the circle of life. It has to be done collectively, but there has to be a vision that is derived from the spirit that will give us the direction and how we're going to survive past these challenges that we're living today. Good.
Val, I would just like to add a few words to that, as someone who's had the privilege and honor of learning from so many wonderful knowledge holders. And what I've been taught and what I've been told is that respect is so important, to honor and respect the people who teach you, and to listen. Don't always be putting forth your view, but step back with humility and listen to what they have to say. And do as much as you can to support what they need and what will help them to do their job. And then do your best to represent what you've learned to others in a good way. And I think all of those steps really help us to put forward Indigenous thought, Indigenous ideas in a way that supports them and all of us ultimately. Thank you.
Val, it's Miles. Can I have a crack at that?
Of course you can.
I think that's a really important question. And I just like to, and the question I heard is, how do environmental groups or NGOs become good allies to Indigenous people or to First Nations? And I know I fall back on my experience with the David Suzuki Foundation with that. David Suzuki has been the first non-Indigenous person that I've met who, right from the get-go, unequivocally doesn't just recognize Indigenous rights and title, he recognizes Indigenous sovereignty, and to the core of his being lives that. And the David Suzuki Foundation has taken that attitude gradually. You know, at the front end, when we're taking positions, we want to respect First Nations. But about 7 or 8 years ago, under Peter Robinson's leadership, the David Suzuki Foundation adopted a policy on Indigenous relations, saying that everything we do as a foundation will be done with respect for the First Nation in whose territory we're operating. And that, on the heels of our efforts to recognize First Nations, to partner with them, you know, without that framework, without that formal commitment, it's been a tough road. You ask David. David, talk about this a bit. I've never seen anybody grovel and apologize so much as you have, sincerely, because you've tried to do what you thought was right, and the First Nation leaders didn't take it that way. And, you know, I know your intentions were good. That's, and, you know, you and we had to take the initiative to make things right. And it's been a tough road, but the David Suzuki Foundation has that policy and is working to respect First Nations in the territory we operate with everything we do. We're not there yet. I think we're a long way from there yet. The systems that are around us, the values of the people who are involved, they're good people. But you change this gradually, and you listen to Dave Courchene, and Indigenous people have lots to offer, have lots to help in this regard, and it's about that commitment to recognizing who we see ourselves as First Nations and building a mutually respectful relationship. It's an ongoing matter. There's no one prescription for it. It's about building that mutually respectful relationship.
You had to bring up all these memories of times I've had to crawl on my belly and apologize for what somebody on our foundation.
I'm just trying to motivate you to remember. Well, talk about it. You meant well, and you couldn't, you know, you weren't trying to get anybody riled up, and they took it different than you presented it, you know, sometimes. And so anyway, we're moving forward. We're making progress.
Yeah, it's not easy. On the gender thing, the DSF has had gender equity, actually more women on the board for many, many years now. Chair of the board is a woman. But we're constantly needing to do better, you know. Well over half of our staff are women, and yet they're not equally represented among the leadership. So it's an ongoing struggle. There's no question that women are going to play the critical role.
But about you apologizing, don't get me wrong. I'm saying you meant well. I'm not saying you were wrong.
Good intentions don't count for anything.
Our next question is really about policy and decision makers. You know, existing policy frameworks in Canada, when you think about wildlife management or resource development, they're often based on Western science paradigms or understandings of Western science. If I think about in my own region, David, you mentioned earlier about the caribou, you know, all of the caribou science that drives decision making is based on radio collar data, and the earliest radio collar data that were put in here in Labrador were in the early 80s. So we don't even have a full life cycle of a caribou in, you know, driving decision making around that. How do we really encourage decision makers and policy makers to think about Indigenous science as and knowledge as science, as something that should be used, and I won't use the word integrate because it is, you know, it kind of implies that dominant paradigm, but really used in parallel to help us make better decisions.
So look, listen, I left out the last page of my notes because I knew I was going on too long, but now I think it's worth mentioning. I was trying to summarize what are the differences between Indigenous knowledge and science. And if we look at science, science was initially driven by curiosity, but increasingly it's being applied for money, for power, or for control. Science says we must be objective, unemotional, don't get involved. They blame Jane Goodall for giving her chimpanzees names. They said you're being anthropomorphic and you're getting too emotionally involved. So science is supposed to have hands off, which means in the end, you don't give a damn about what the implications are for your science. Science is reductionist, so it fragments and can't see the whole. Science is constantly being modified and discarded. You know, a couple of examples, you know, before many decades ago now, DFO's management of sockeye was based on the assumption that sockeye fry are born and go right out to sea. And only then, years later, they discovered sockeye stay in fresh water for a year before going out to sea, unlike the others. We had the whole ocean, the chain of life was based on phytoplankton, the tiny photosynthesizing organisms in the ocean. Everything stemmed from that, and all of the models were built on that. And then about 20 years ago, they discovered plankton that were so small, they went through the plankton nets. They're now called picoplankton, and they are considered to be so abundant and important, they provide half of the oxygen that comes from the oceans now. And 20 years ago, we didn't even know they existed. So we ought to have a great deal more of humility about what science is providing. Indigenous knowledge is fundamentally different from science. No Indigenous person would say, I am outside the system that I'm studying. I'm looking at it unemotionally. I'm going to assign numbers to these animals so that I don't get involved. I mean, Indigenous knowledge is based on an immersion, a celebration, a gratitude for nature's abundance. And with that gratitude and understanding comes the reciprocity of responsibility to care for it. That's a fundamental aspect, it seems to me, of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is critical for survival. It's what has allowed people to stay in place for thousands of years. And it's based on generations of observation, of failures, of successes, of mistakes. All of that is the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of life-giving experience that is the base of culture. And therefore, since this knowledge is so fundamental, it is always looking at the whole picture and is always cautionary. And I believe that what we need then is a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding of how those ways differ. But the Indigenous knowledge of the whole system and of long-term perspective then, and the caution that comes with the way we act, must guide science as it fleshes out the details within that bigger picture. So there's a huge role that Indigenous knowledge has to play in terms of just guiding and what we do and implementing our strategies.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think, you know, in many ways, it could be, there's an imperative for a precautionary approach in resource management that is kind of innate, and that's something that I've found that Western science has really struggled with, how to think about applying a precautionary approach in the absence of those things that you described in the relationships understanding. And I certainly see as a forester that the Indigenous knowledge systems and sciences should really be used in thinking about the precautionary approach to resource management. And our next question, we've got time for only maybe 2 more questions. And then we'll ask for some wrap-up comments. These have been really great, and just note that this dialogue is the first of many and will be ongoing, and so there will be specific dialogues on specific topics. I know there were questions on things like ethical space, for example, those sorts of things, and so there will be a special session on ethical space and others, so stay tuned. So if your question wasn't answered, don't worry, it will be over time, and please do plan on joining us. Miles and Dave Courchene, what do you see the role of youth as leaders in asserting and keeping alive the Indigenous ways of knowing?
I think, first of all, you know, it all begins with education. You know, like I said earlier, you know, we have to revolutionize the whole approach to education. And as Indigenous people and knowledge keepers, you know, we can define that education that the young people should be learning. You know, there's teachings, you know, that are shared in our lodges that we are reminded of, that every child is born with rights. That child is born with the right to have good parents. that child is born, to be given the best support that they can receive so that they can have a foundation, to lead a good and healthy way of life. But also there's the right to be told the truth. The children have been denied the truth for so long that they've not been allowed, to experience where the spirit of truth is really reflected, is it within nature itself. So we have to position our children in an environment that they can hear these teachings. And when they need to be a part of ceremony, so they can feel what is being invoked within that environment. And I know that, at the end of the day, when we've heard and listened to the teachings of the elders, then life becomes a ceremony itself, because your life is about gratitude now. You appreciate what you have. You appreciate all that you have been given. And there was a quote, that Chief Dan George had said. He said, "Nothing belongs to you of what there is. Of what to take, you must share." It's about sharing. That's what the children need to learn, how to give, how to share, and how to serve the greater cause, that is before us. And that is to bring the essence of the spirit of that knowledge that is embedded within our language, within our teachings, that love, is the emergent property that brings everything together, that binds us all together. It makes us, relatives, that we are truly brothers and sisters. I remember one time when the past leader, Paul Martin, asked me, he said, "How do we change the narrative in this country the way that the Canadian public views, the stereotype of Indigenous people?" And I said, "Paul, the answer is simple. Bring us your children. Let us have your children for a while, and we'll teach them about life. We'll teach them about the values. We will teach them about the rules of conduct and how we should live and behave here on the land, to really, really, really feel the love that, that comes from the land itself. So that those changes we can make now. It may not take everybody to really fully support it, but change never happens by the masses. It takes a few individuals that have a commitment and faith and saying that's the direction that we need to go. And Indigenous people, knowledge keepers, have this spiritual connection to access the dreams that will define, the direction that we need to go. You bet.
Val, again, I think that's a really important question, is how do we prepare our youth for leadership? And I think that's the question of our future. We need to imbue in our young people our way of knowing each of our nations. And there's much we have in common, as Dave Courchene constantly reminds us of. But each of our peoples, each of our Indigenous peoples and nations must teach our people about our way of knowing and make available to them opportunities for other education, like in schools and in regular school, post-secondary, whatever kind of academic learning they want to know. Having them both in our nations is very important, and we need to bring as much discipline to our way of knowing, which our people always, our ways were very disciplined, and our oral traditions were very strict and very rigid, and we need to get back to that and train and bring our people up. So if you want to be a lawyer, great. If you want to run a watchman program at home according to Haida values and Haida ways, or whoever your nation is, it's equally important and equally has standing amongst our people. You know, my father was Kikal Nung Kilslas, and he believed in education and culture, not one overriding the other, but having young people brought up and trained in both traditions. And if they wanted to choose one or the other, that was up to them. But I think our futures depend on it, and certainly reconciliation depends on it. a good question.
Thank you, Miles and Dave. The final question before we ask for closing comments is one from an Indigenous colleague, and she says, thank you to the respective relatives, that one of the problems of colonial or Western science is that it should always be based on observation, and it often denies the importance of observation in favor of pre-existing theory. You know, it's almost as if the scientists are saying, even if it were true, I wouldn't believe it. This is a kind of scientific imperialism. And so, and I'd in particular like to hear Nancy and David on this. How do we bring back openness and values back into kind of Western sciences as it always has existed in Indigenous sciences?
Well, I'd like to hear David's reaction to that. It's something, it's a very important question. There are many different sciences, for one thing, and some of them are more in that vein than others. There are other fields of science, like the science of ecology, for example, that maybe is closer to Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge than others. And this isn't answering the question, but I just wanted to make the observation that science, although we strive in science to be totally objective, we are in fact not objective at all. And our work is based on our values. There's certain work that we wouldn't do because of our values. And so although we tell ourselves that even if it were true, I wouldn't believe it, most of us as scientists, you know, would admit to ourselves that we actually do have these opinions and values and know in our own minds, you know, the fundamental truths. But I'd like to hear David's reaction to that.
David, you're on mute.
Thank you, Nancy. You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, this whole notion of objectivity is such a crock. The reason why women have been critical to be brought into broadcasting or any other area, or, you know, news reporting is, you know, if everybody is reporting objective truth, then it wouldn't matter what your gender or your color or your religion or any of that would matter. We're all shaped by gender, by ethnicity, by socioeconomic force. They all shape the way that we see the world. And so the greater diversity you have, the greater we're going to approach something that might be a reality. In science, it's no different. In science, you know, I keep telling Miles, you know, well, I agree with Miles most of the time, but when I disagree with him, I say, stop being so human, damn it. He's just another human being, you know, with his own biases and values that may differ from mine. In science, especially now that science is being tied more and more to a payoff. That is, if you make a discovery that can be patented and make money, science has become much more secretive than it was when I started out. Certainly when I started out back in the late 50s, you know, if I was doing an experiment that might overlap with something someone else was doing, I would call him up or her up and say, hey, look, I'm thinking of doing this. Is that going to interfere with what you're doing? And we'd work it out. Now you'd never do that because I might make a discovery I could patent. I'm not going to share with them. So that's one aspect I think has really been the detriment of science. But the other thing is we're human beings and we get committed to seeing, you know, I was studying a very arcane aspect of chromosome behavior. And, you know, there may have been 10 people in the world that gave a damn about it, but I got really tied up in my theory of what was going on. And I would tend to regard anybody coming in with a different idea, saying, that's crappy science or whatever, because we're human beings and wedded we're not open to considering everything because we've got something vested in it. And the only way to get around that is to constantly point out, hey, look, you know, this is science. I'm not attacking you as a person. Doesn't mean I want to diminish your contribution. Get your ego out of the way and consider this. But it's a tough one.
David, I always like to say, the only thing I like better than being right is being shown a better way.
Uh-huh.
So you look at the experience here in Haida Gwaii, Nancy, and your work is you got more examples of it than this. But one of the benefits of the agreement with Canada over Gwaii Haida Heritage Site and Natural Park Reserves, we've been able to do a lot of scientific study. You know, we have our Haida knowledge, our Haida ways of knowing, and that narrative, of course, it's our first narrative. But one thing we've found is that all the scientific research, the anthropological research, the fisheries research, all that has corroborated Haida oral knowledge. And I think we'd find that we should have a stream. We should have one section of this dialogue on that. I think that would be really interesting, but that's what we've found. And there's a lot of good stories along that line.
Thanks, Miles, Nancy, and Dave for that. David, for that answer. We're almost at time. Dave Courchene, I'm going to hold off because you're going to close us off with some final thoughts. But before we do that, I'd like to ask Miles, Nancy, and David if they had, you know, as a result of this dialogue and the questions, if you had any kind of final closing thoughts to offer, and to keep it quite brief because we're just at time now.
Well, my hope is that out of this process, it's going to be more than a mere academic discussion, that we are going to come up with some very concrete ideas about how we go forward with this reconciling the two ways of knowing. It's got to be more than just an academically interesting exercise. It's got now to shape policy and actions of government, it seems to me, and the private sector.
I won't add anything more. I just want to thank all of you. It's been really enjoyable having this discussion and listening to the questions and the answers of my colleagues. And so thank you so much. Thanks, Val.
Thanks, Nancy.
I'd like to thank Jacquie Miller and Valérie Courtois for your role, and all your support staff, Darren Ma, all the support staff who pulled this together over the past few months and even years. We've gone through a lot of ups and downs and a lot of uncertainty. And today's beginning dialogue, I think, is a really good start to a necessary dialogue in this country. I want to thank all the panelists, Nancy, David, and Dave Courchene, for giving very insightful direction and comments on this. And you're right, we don't want to be just talkers. We're going to have, I hope, monthly issues that come out of this dialogue, issues such as fisheries ways of knowing, herring, other fisheries on the coast, and bring in people who are involved in those issues and spend time in a dialogue such as this around herring issues, for example, sockeye. We're going to have international processes, you know, the Aichi targets that the United Nations has set, the Paris Accord. How does Indigenous traditional knowledge and science work together to further those initiatives? Really importantly in this country, land and marine use planning. Canada has committed to big targets in terms of conservation around land and marine use planning. One thing we found in the last 3 years is Indigenous-led land and marine use planning is a good thing. It's a very good thing, and we need to strengthen that. Let's pull everybody together here who's working on that and have a dialogue on that and build partnerships amongst different groups. Build alliances around like-minded people and let's turn this talk into specific action. And I'd like everybody to think about what specific action do we want out of this dialogue. We're going to pull that together and we'll share that with you, but it's about listening to you, those who are, all of you who are participating in this, to send your input forward. In terms of output, I want to find ways of reconciling amongst ourselves as Indigenous people and Canadians in this country. What do we need to do that? Establish a nation-to-nation relationship. How do we address issues of our time, huge global issues like the climate crisis, like biodiversity loss? How do we use these two ways of knowing and with specific actions to deal with that? And one that's in front of us right now, we must, and I think I'm speaking for David here too, he doesn't like economists, but we must reimagine our economy based on what we know to be true, not on some fantasies like economic growth. So let's put our heads together and really focus on these outcomes. If this pandemic has done anything, it's given us an opportunity to make transformative change that we might not have had the fortitude to do previously, but now it's imperative. We need to make these deep changes in order to be sustainable, in order to be healthy going forward. So obviously I'm excited by the beginning of this dialogue. Thank you to everyone who registered and signed up and is participating in this dialogue, and let's keep this important dialogue going. Thank you. Hawa.
Well, Elder Dr. Dave Courchene, please close us off.
You know, in keeping with the spirit of the opening prayer, you know, let me close this conversation today and acknowledge the Spirit once again for orchestrating this gathering where we were brought together, influenced by the Spirit itself. And there is a word we say in our language as Anishinaabe people when we make reference to the higher power of intelligence called the Spirit. We say, "Kinanakumigo," thank you, thank you. And it's a word of gratitude that comes from the heart. It comes from the Spirit. You feel that word in the language of full appreciation of what blessings that we have been given. And I say, words of gratitude to Mother Earth. And we acknowledge that she is suffering also because of our behavior, but her unconditional love never wavers. She continues to provide what we need in order to live and to survive. And I hope that, you know, the people that are listening, you know, that you get inspired by what you heard today. That, you know, collectively we have to be able to walk down that same path where we will reconcile with the wrongs that have been done, and that we will find that world that we were asked to do in a sacred covenant that we made with the Great Spirit, and that was to bring love and peace into the world. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to all those that put the effort to bring us together. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Dave Courchene. And just from my part, it's been a genuine honor to have had the opportunity to moderate the sessions. The questions were great. Thank you to all the participants. I've been watching the participant numbers over time. There's still over 300 participants now, 2 hours into the session. That's a remarkable for a Zoom session that's long. So stay tuned. And I'd like to now turn it back over to Jacquie Miller, our host.
Thanks, Val, and thanks to all of our speakers and to all of our attendees who've joined us today via Zoom and via Facebook Live. In total, we had close to 650 people, or maybe around 700 around at our peak live, and lots of people are subscribed to get the update via our email list. So I just wanted to note that we're going to be sending out a short survey after the session to get your thoughts. And we hope that you can take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us on today's session and our plans going forward. And we're working to organize another couple of sessions. We're looking to organize one on ethical space in late August and the ethics of knowledge co-production, and we'll announce those details once they're confirmed. And we're also organizing a dialogue with Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, in late September. And we plan to present about one dialogue per month over the next about a year. So we ask that you sign up to our mailing list on our website at waysofknowingforum.ca to be sure that you're signed up for those updates, and to follow us on your social media platforms of LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. And last but not least, we ask that you donate to help support our ability to bring you these dialogues, which you can do at waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you.